Welcome to your last AP Biology video notes. This one is going to be about photosynthesis, sort of the complementary process to cellular respiration. So when we talk about photosynthesis, hopefully you think of plants. Now there are other organisms that perform photosynthesis. There's some prokaryotes, but specifically in plants, think for a second, where does photosynthesis happen? Hopefully you said chloroplast. Here's a picture of a chloroplast. It's kind of similar to a mitochondria. So if we draw a mitochondria here, that's not great, but in that it has an inner membrane or inner membranes inside. So where the mitochondria has that double membrane system where there's its outside membrane and also its inside membrane, the chloroplast also has that. It has its outside membrane and then it has inside membranes as well. So we call these inner membranes, they kind of look like stacks of pancakes, which is convenient to think about them as because, pancakes have syrup on them and photosynthesis makes sugar. Anyway, we call those thylakoids, and this is the thylakoid membrane. The space that is outside of the thylakoids is called the stroma. So those are probably the only two that you might need to know. So the overall goal, the overall process of photosynthesis is to take energy from light, typically from the sun, and convert that into energy in sugar or food. So again, this is not taking atoms from the sun and turning them into the atoms of sugar. Similar with cellular respiration, where we're taking energy out of food and putting it into energy in ATP. Here we're taking energy from the sun and putting it into energy in the bonds of sugar. Kind of as a side note, as I mentioned, not only plants do photosynthesis, the first organisms to do photosynthesis were prokaryotes, so bacteria, specifically algae in the ocean. And since photosynthesis, as we'll see, produces oxygen, these were the organisms responsible for putting oxygen into the atmosphere on Earth. Before photosynthesis started, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, or very little oxygen in the atmosphere on Earth. So this sort of paved the way for different organisms to do cellular respiration because they needed oxygen for that. So I don't want you to think of like the prokaryotes were like trying to make oxygen for the animals or whatever. It's not really how it works. The oxygen is just kind of like a waste product, like a byproduct they create by accident in the process of trying to harvest energy from the sun, and then conveniently that worked out for organisms that later developed cellular respiration. So photosynthesis occurs in two basic steps, so less steps than we have to worry about in cellular respiration, but they are a bit complicated. The goal of step one is to capture the light energy into molecules, and then the goal for step two is to actually make the sugar, the glucose. So you could think of this as like step one is the photo part, because photo means light, and step two as the synthesis part. Synthesis is like building things. Here's our overall equation. So we've got water and carbon dioxide going in. Plants need water to grow, you should probably be aware. They also need carbon dioxide to grow. And then light, which is our energy source. And what is produced is, this is glucose and then also oxygen. Now, once the plant makes the glucose, it could use it and put it right into cellular respiration to use it for energy. One thing I want you to realize is that it's not that animals do cellular respiration and plants do photosynthesis. Plants do both. I'll write that. Plants do both cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So it's not like they're really opposite processes in the sense that like this is the plant version of cellular respiration. This process takes energy from light and puts it into food, and cellular respiration takes energy from food and puts it into ATP. So it's not really a circle, it's kind of a one-way line actually, where all the energy is being input as light and eventually gets converted to ATP. Now, plants do need ATP. They still, even though they don't move around, have cellular processes like building molecules that require ATP. They also can take this glucose and use it to build things like cellulose that makes up their cell walls. Because remember, cellulose is a carbohydrate, so it's a long chain of glucose molecules. So this glucose that the plants make has multiple uses for them, both for converting into energy and also for building the structure of the plant itself. Okay, there were some understanding check questions here. Yeah, you can try to sketch a chloroplast if you'd like. Let's address this question. Can you gain energy from the sun directly? Well, you might feel like happier or more energetic if you go out in the sun, but no, you cannot perform photosynthesis. You can't actually get energy from the sun. You have to eat food to get energy. There are some crazy people out there who call themselves breathers and believe that they can get energy just from like breathing and standing out in the sun. I'm pretty sure that they're just kind of lying about that, but yeah, there's some people who claim that. All right, so now we're going to look at the details of that step 1 in the process, which is also called the light reactions, the photo part of photosynthesis. So if we're looking in the chloroplast, we had those stacks of thylakoids. This is occurring on that thylakoid membrane. So embedded in that membrane is where this light reaction process is occurring. So embedded in that membrane, there are light harvesting pigments, which are represented by these little green dots. Well, the most well-known of these is chlorophyll. Probably heard of chlorophyll. There's a couple different types of chlorophyll. There are other pigments as well. There's some that are more red or purple that you might see in like Japanese maples, or certain plants that have a red or a purpley color. There's also some that are more yellow. But anyway, we'll just focus on chlorophyll since that's the most well-known one, which is green, of course. So you have all these little chlorophylls embedded in that thylakoid membrane. So like if this is the thylakoid, here's our bunch of little chlorophylls embedded in there. And then there's a special molecule with them called a reaction center. And now this is happening in different places, like all around this thylakoid membrane. There's these different little groups of chlorophylls, but we'll just focus in on one of those groups. So we call this whole thing together, the group of chlorophylls and its reaction center, the photosystem. So first thing that's going to happen is light is going to come in and get absorbed by one of the chlorophylls. So as the light comes in and is absorbed by a chlorophyll, so one photon of light will excite one electron. So basically this electron is going to absorb that energy and become at a higher energy level. It's going to kind of fly off the chlorophyll molecule and bump into the next nearest chlorophyll molecule, which will hit an electron on that chlorophyll molecule, which will fly off and bump into an electron on the next chlorophyll molecule. And then the same thing will happen until eventually one of those electrons that's flying around because it got energized is going to land in the reaction center. So it's kind of a chain reaction, like think like a line of pool balls, right? You hit the first pool ball, that's like the light coming in, and then it hits the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one, and eventually it falls, if you're good enough, I guess, one falls into the pocket. So eventually an electron lands on this reaction center. From the reaction center, this little electron is moved out of the photosystem to a different protein complex called the primary electron acceptor. So if we're tracing the path of electrons, it's kind of this red line here. And remember, this is a high energy electron because it's got that energy that came from that photon of light. So we'll leave that electron at the primary electron acceptor for a minute because our photosystem has a problem now. Because remember that first chlorophyll that got hit by the light photon lost an electron. The electron flew away to the next chlorophyll. So this chlorophyll right here is down one electron. And that's a problem for it. It can't just keep losing electrons. Every time an electron leaves, it's harder for another one to leave. So it needs to replace that missing electron. It has to replace it in order for photosynthesis to continue. So the way the electron is replaced is it's taken from water. So remember, water was one of the required components of photosynthesis. So here's where the water comes in. The plant has the ability to split water. It breaks it up into the oxygen part of water, which will join with another oxygen from another chlorophyll that's doing the same thing, becomes oxygen gas. And then the hydrogen part of water is split up into H plus and electrons, because a hydrogen is just an atom with one proton and one electron, just splits those up. So now we have just a one proton basically, and then an electron. So the electron can go into the photosystem, the chlorophyll, and replace that one electron that got lost. The oxygen just leaves. It's released as a waste product. So remember, the plant's not trying to make oxygen. Oxygen's just the byproduct of this water splitting process. And so the oxygen just leaves and goes into the atmosphere. The hydrogen ions are going to end up, and we'll see this later, going to an electron transport chain similar to what we saw in cellular respiration. Okay, so this is a really key part here, this splitting of water. Sometimes you'll get questions on the AP exam related to, you might have the equation, right? You have water and carbon dioxide, and you get glucose and oxygen, and in some way the question will get at, where did this oxygen come from? So this oxygen is not the oxygen that was in the carbon dioxide. A lot of people think that, oh, plants turn carbon dioxide into oxygen. They don't actually. The oxygen is the oxygen that was in the water. So again, the oxygen produced by plants during photosynthesis does not come from the carbon dioxide. The oxygen in the carbon dioxide ends up in the glucose. It comes from the oxygen that was in the water. It comes from the splitting of water. All right, so we are going to go back to this electron right here that got bumped to the primary electron acceptor. Now, to make this even more confusing, this photosystem that we've just been talking about, this kind of photosystem, even though it kind of comes first, this is known as photosystem 2. The reason for that being is because scientists discovered photosystem 1 first, and so that just became photosystem 1, even though it's the second one. Yeah, I know, I just wanted to make this more confusing to you. But anyway, so this electron that got bumped to the primary electron acceptor is now going to enter an electron transport chain, very similar to the one in cellular respiration. So the electrons are going to do the same, bumping from protein to protein all the way down the chain, releasing their energy, that energy that they got from the sun originally. They're going to use that energy to pump those hydrogen ions out and create a gradient, again, just like in cellular respiration. And then the hydrogen ions are going to go through an ATP synthase, and ATP is going to be produced. Again, just like we saw in cellular respiration. So this part of photosynthesis will make some ATP. That ATP is going to be used later to actually build the glucose. And then once that electron gets to the end of the electron transport chain, rather than in cellular respiration it was taken by oxygen and turned into water, it's going to be taken by photosystem 1. So it's going to land in photosystem 1. And then here's some review questions. If we were doing this in class, we'd talk about it, but if you'd like to talk through it yourself, double check again. Okay. We're almost through the light reactions. So finally, photosystem 1, the second one. This photosystem is kind of doing the same thing photosystem 2 was doing. Light is coming in, electrons are getting energized and bumped to the reaction center, and then taken up to a primary electron acceptor. Now, since this photosystem has also lost an electron, it needs to replace an electron too, and its electron, replacement electron, is conveniently been sent from photosystem 2. So after it goes down the electron transport chain, photosystem 1 gets its replacement electron, the one that originally came from photosystem 2. Now the energized electron that's been bumped out of photosystem 1 ends up going to a carrier molecule called NADPH, which is very similar to NAD or NADH. It just also has a phosphorus on it. So it's a similar molecule with a similar function. It's a carrier for a high energy electron. Okay, so that ends the light reactions. Let's kind of go through this again, follow the bouncing electron, etc. So, photosystem 2. Light comes in, energizes an electron in a chlorophyll, electron bumps to the next chlorophyll, then the next chlorophyll, etc., until it lands at the reaction center. From the reaction center, the electron goes to a primary electron acceptor. From there, electron moves down an electron transport chain embedded in that thylakoid membrane. Hydrogens are pumped across the membrane using the energy from that electron, and then they pass through an ATP synthase, producing ATP. After the electron has traveled down the electron transport chain, it ends up in photosystem 1. Meanwhile, in photosystem 1, light is also coming in, energizing electrons from chlorophylls, which get bumped to the reaction center, and then eventually the primary electron acceptor. Those electrons move down and are taken by a molecule called NADP+, which becomes NADPH. Oh, I should also mention that those hydrogens that came down the electron transport chain, this is where they end up as well. They join up with the NADP+ to become the NADPH. Okay, and then over here now at photosystem 2, we had an issue. We lost an electron. In order to replace that electron, water is split. Electrons from water replace the lost electron. Oxygen from water just floats away. Hydrogens from the water are the ones that get pumped out here in the electron transport chain and then eventually join up with the NADPH. Ooh, so I know that's a lot. Might be helpful to watch it again or to watch another explanation of this, but that is our light reactions. So to summarize the light reactions, what went into the light reaction phase? Water went in. We had NADP+, light, and then ADP and phosphate because we produced some ATP from the electron transport chain. What came out of the light reactions? oxygen from the water came out, and that was just a waste product for the plant. NADPH came out with the combination of the NADP plus and the hydrogens and electrons from water. And then ATP, energy, came out made of this stuff, and then the energy from the electron that was energized by light. So now we're ready for step 2. Step 2 is called the Calvin cycle. It's also sometimes called the dark reactions in contrast with the light reactions. It's a bit of a misnomer because while the Calvin cycle can take place in the dark, it can also take place in the light, so it's not limited only to when it's dark, as opposed to the light reactions, which do require light in order for them to happen. So at night, a plant is not able to do the light reactions, but it is able to carry on with the Calvin cycle or the dark reactions. So the Calvin cycle is where we finally get to our goal of making the glucose. Now, this is another complicated cycle like the citric acid cycle where there's a lot of steps and different molecules involved. Fortunately, we don't need to know all of the steps. We're just going to kind of look at the overall what goes in, what comes out of that. So where this is taking place in the stroma of the chloroplast. So the light reactions were taking place embedded in these thylakoid membranes. The Calvin cycle is happening in the space outside of those inner membranes, the stroma. So again, the goal is to build glucose. Here's our formula for glucose. So obviously for glucose we need some carbon. That's going to come from carbon dioxide. The leaves have little holes in them, little pores, and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere can just come into those pores for the leaf to use. The oxygen is also going to come from the carbon dioxide. We also need hydrogen. So the hydrogen is coming from the water that was split, and then we need energy to put it all together because building molecules requires energy, and the whole point of this is that we're going to be able to store energy in the bonds between these molecules. And so that energy is going to come from the energized electrons that came from photosystem 1 that have been transferred there by the NADPH, because that's our electron carrier, and also that ATP we made in the electron transport chain between photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. So we've got, in the light reactions, we've sort of assembled all of our ingredients for putting together the glucose, except for the carbon dioxide, which just came from the atmosphere. And the Calvin cycle is going to be this long process of putting all of that stuff together and finally coming out with our glucose. So you should also note that these two chemical reactions are sort of opposites of each other, right? If you just look at the molecules, the atoms, those are cycling around and around, right? Carbon dioxide and water go in, glucose and oxygen come out, and then glucose and oxygen come in, carbon dioxide and water come out. So the atoms cycle around and around. The energy is a line. Sun energy comes in, ATP, energy, and heat comes out. And that's not a circle. So the ultimate source of all energy, or almost all energy in an ecosystem, is the sun. All right, so I think that's going to be it for photosynthesis. So I hope you have a good rest of your day and you're able to come to the review session.